Here, you can add titles like "Welcome to my stream" and descriptions like
Imagine a world without prejudice, bullying, or fear. Imagine a world where our individuality is respected by all our peers. Inclusion and equity are more than words or just a ploy. They are workplaces rich with diversity, creating worlds we all enjoy. Imagine a better world where we all can live free and play, where the spirit of teamwork and solidarity give hope and light the way. Good business isn't just profits or pushing for sales. Good business must strive to be just as it scales. Good business is planting a seed and a visionary trail to foster an environment where diverse abilities prevail. Let's build that new world in solidarity. Diversity rocks innovation. Let's build solutions for equality to bring hope and transformation. Let's honor co-creation, honor individuality, with a vision for togetherness beyond screens and virtual reality. All it takes is a little to change the world a lot. Money comes and goes, but legacy isn't forgotten.
Welcome to Diversity Rocks Innovation. I am so pleased to meet all of you today. My name is Jackie Steele. I'm a longtime Canadian political scientist living and working, teaching in Japan. And I'm also the CEO and Chief Diversity Officer of Enjoi, Diversity and Innovation. Enjoi is a Japan-based, global-facing business working in English, Japanese, and French. And we are committed to providing research, policy, and evidence-based diversity, equity, and innovation training and education to leaders and corporations. We see value in the importance of intersectional diversity, accessibility, and of democratizing forms of innovation so that we can build vibrancy and holistic well-being into our people systems everywhere, all the time. This live stream shines a spotlight on the beautiful diversity of Enjoi D&I thought partners who are each making individual efforts to bring inclusive, diversity positive, and gender equal leadership into the world in their own unique way. How are we doing this? Well, one of the things we want to show today is the value of the concept and practice of thought partnering out loud. I learned about this practice several years ago from a leadership coach named Izumi Yamamoto in Seattle, who I had the pleasure of learning from. And it stuck with me as such an important part of lifelong learning and as a practice of solidarity building with and through the rich experiences and insights of others. And I've decided to make it a pillar of how Enjoi is a business that is committed to democratization and solidarity building, committed to reciprocal giving of ourselves and respect for differences across, leaders, stakeholders, actors in our networks, both here in Japan and across Asia Pacific, to try and role model this more and make it, public in the world. Mieru kasuru in Japanese, we would say. So the live stream format, I'll just introduce briefly. Basically, each week I'm going to invite one of my Enjoi D&I collaborators and thought partners. There's about 100 in this network. And I will be showing up with them. We'll just be human beings, individuals, minus the business card, throw the meishi out the door, minus our senpai kohai relationships, and really in defiance of the various, what are often toxic, gendered, racializing, age-based, ability-based hierarchies that our societies despite being democracies, keep perpetuating through our laws and our policies and our norms and our culture. So we want to show up today in a horizontal relationship based on respect for ourselves, our individualities, our diversities, and to thought partner across our radical individuality out loud, real time. So through this, we will enjoy a collegial exchange of expertise, worldviews, identities, experiences, and this will be a very intentional act of thought partnering out loud to learn from each other, gain awareness, and enrich our understanding of the complexities of the other person, because there's so many gray zones of the human experience and of each other's lived realities here on Earth. And in this particularly unique moment in 2021 during a global pandemic that seems to not end. So Enjoi's mission as a company is to try and bring this live stream forward. I guess one of my observations has been that for the last 20 years of studying political philosophy and critical theories and thinking about, how do we move the dial on happiness and well-being? And I guess I've been feeling that one of the reasons I pivoted out of academia was to try and build a company that could maybe bring political philosophy and the fun and the creativity of political philosophy back into the world, maybe through business, so that we could have more time for reflecting on our human experience. How do we build, new systems and build the good life for all of us, and take that time to engage with these broader explorations of the purpose of our existence and our journey into well-being and thriving here on Earth. So in my experience, political philosophy, citizenship studies, diversity studies, civics, ethics, all of these interesting knowledge systems and practices and thoughts, and they really can help us build resilient happiness, well-being, and a mutually supporting togetherness here, both for emotional, physical, and our environmental needs as a species, where hopefully we can find a more thriving interdependence and balance. So political philosophy is core to nourishing my soul, and I hope that we can deliver a little bit of that through this live stream today. If you are joining at 7 p.m. on Monday from Vancouver, if you're joining at 10 p.m. from New York, 10 a.m. from Bangkok, or during lunch hour at 12 p.m. here in Japan, I invite you to take just 55 minutes to join us in our journey of seeking out these nuances in ourselves and in each other, to find enjoyment in the rich diversity that really is a blessing to our families, our colleagues, our friends, and that stands to enrich us immensely. And it's a driver also of innovation when it is supported by equality, equity, and ties of solidarity. So let us be open today to the gray zones around race, gender, ability, nationality, language, sexual orientation, professional expertise, whatever it is. Let us move away from judgmental absolutes, the black, white, or totalitarian dictates about who we are and what boxes we fit in. Let us find time for those in-between spaces of our identities that make, in fact, I think, the project of democratic self-government so exciting. And so with pursuing in solidarity with one another, and it can be pursued in every space of democracy, in our homes, in our couple, in our bedrooms, in our workplaces, our communities, our countries, and of course, through our transnational social justice and global sustainability networks. With that, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you my first guest for Volume 1. For those who know me, this individual needs very little introduction. For those who don't know me, Mr. Mits Matsushita is the thought partner of all thought partners in my life. He is such an incredibly generous and caring individual who shows up for me every single day for all of my crazy ideas, all of my diversity feminist visionings and goals, and my democratic projects and volunteerism, and for Enjoi, this new journey Enjoi Diversity and Innovation is trying to bring into the world. And so, yes, we are literally here, remote work from home here in northern Nagano, joining this live stream together, but from our separate home offices within the same house. So Mitss, welcome to Diversity Rocks Innovation, and thank you for joining me today for this Volume 1 of Thought Partnering Out Loud. I'm so glad to be sharing it with you.
Hi, great pleasure and honor to be here and I guess be the first in this great road that you're traveling on, and I'm more than happy to support you in any way I can. And I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Well, I think today, one of the goals is to sort of do a deep dive into some of your experiences, how you understand your diversities, your complexities, your gray zones as an individual, both, from your perspective of your time, I guess, living in Canada, and then also your more recent journey into Japan. I wonder if you could just take a moment, give us a brief introduction, tell us a bit about yourself and what is most important to your identities and your sense of self.
Sure. I have always called myself, I guess I'm a third generation Japanese Canadian, born and raised in Montreal. For those that Eastern Canada, French speaking city. So I grew up speaking French and playing hockey, a true Canadian. But my full bilingualism ends there. I only speak very basic Japanese. So I joke about it in here in Japan that I'm bilingual. I'm fully bilingual, but of course they expect it to be Japanese, but no, it's French. My parents were both born and raised in Canada. They are Canadians, but my grandparents, all four grandparents, are Japanese nationals, born in Japan. So as a third generation full Japanese, as opposed to, I guess, some are mixed parents, grandparents, half. I think they call it hafu, which was a term I've learned recently.
And so, I mean, you've so much of your experience, I guess maybe you could tell me a bit about when you were in Canada. Did you introduce yourself as a Japanese Canadian?
It's an interesting one. Yes, I guess I always did say I'm a Japanese Canadian. And I don't really have the history, and this is maybe a good question from my parents, but again, my name is Mitsuo for the Japanese people. That
like your legal name is actually
Mitsuo Matsushita. But I guess as a youth in Montreal, I was always known as Mitss, abbreviated from Mitsuo, Mitss. And I think everybody called me that, and I assume that's because that's the way I introduced myself. In fact, to this day, when I speak to friends from Montreal, hey, Mitss, how you doing? I'm still called that. When I moved some 25 years ago or so, I moved from Eastern Canada, Montreal, to Western Canada, Edmonton, primarily an English-speaking province. My name transitioned to Mitss as I use today, as I introduce myself today as Mitts, as in gloves and mitts.
So I see. So you've gone from being like meats that you would eat, meats to mitts. The mitts that you'd wear.
And I was actually
winter.
Oblivious to this. I didn't realize that if I'm talking to somebody in Montreal, I'm Mitts, but if today I'm Mitts. And it was you, Jackie, that pointed it out. I think I was probably talking to my sister, or my sister was saying something, and Tatsi said Mitts. And you said to me, why does she say Mitts? And I think, and it triggered the question, which I still don't have the answer to, as to why I'm Mitts to some people from Montreal, or to most people in Montreal, but I'm Mitts to everybody else. And that's purely me. I introduce myself that way. Why I transitioned is a mystery.
Well, and when we met in Ottawa through our taiko community in Ottawa, I learned your name as Mitts.
Because I had just come from Edmonton.
Right.
So after the move to Edmonton, I transitioned to Mitts, and it stuck. Okay. So even today, if I go back to Montreal and I meet somebody meet somebody.
So your name
I'm
oscillates.
introduced to somebody for the first time. I'm Mitts. I'm no longer Mitts.
And then now you're in Japan and you're Matsushita-san.
Matsushita-san.
You're like, who?
Who's that? Yeah, I don't know who they're talking about. I'm oblivious to that one.
Interesting. Well, and I mean, obviously, naming is obviously a really important part of our identity, and it often does, correlate with our linguistic community and how that gets framed, and whether it's something that the different populations can pronounce, right? And so the whole issue of shortening names that are not standardized Anglophone names in Canada to something that is more easily pronounced by Anglophones often is kind of what happens, what ends up happening, because it's not intuitive to know how to say Mitsu or with the right pronunciation necessarily, unless you're in the Japanese Canadian community, in which case that's a different story. But I know that you have felt strongly about, thinking back on and capturing and documenting your family history. And I know we've discussed often about the history of your parents and your grandparents. And in the context of, me as a political scientist, I was so fascinated. And going back to my McGill studies, the first thing I remember writing an essay on, and I'm not really, maybe it was because I was studying Japanese and so already had that on my radar. But I remember my first essay being about wanting to research the Japanese Canadian internment, because I didn't understand why that happened in Canadian politics and in that time in history. It didn't make sense to me given everything I had been learning about, Canadian constitutional protections of equality and diversity. And then I thought, well, wow. And then the history class learning about the internment. And you've mentioned today that you would be open to sharing about your parents' experience of that. Could you tell us a little bit about how that has affected you and how you have worked to keep those learnings alive?
Well, one thing that, and you sort of mentioned, and I did some, I'm going to say about 10 years ago or so. My father passed away several years ago, but before my father passed away, I traveled down to Toronto where they were living to interview them. And it was, I think, other than, one of the best ideas I'd ever had. And it's certainly something that I've shared with many other people. As soon as we start talking about heritage and where you came from, I say, interview your parents while your parents are still with us. I sent my parents a list of questions and we tried to stay in chronological order, because the question of where did your parents meet, why did your parents, or what happened, certainly for us, the whole intern during the war is a big part of their growing up. So I had no idea growing up any of that history. I didn't understand anything about it. So I interviewed them and I got a lot of that information, which was eye-opening, not only from the intern being interned part of it, but also just, how did my mom end up from here to here to here, and where did my parents meet? Excuse me, was terrifically insightful. But to touch on what you asked, Jackie, the one thing I think I personally took away from, having talked to my parents about the being interned, was that they didn't hold a grudge. Yes, it was a horrible thing. And for those that don't know, I mean, I'm not a historian, but you can go look up the Canadian intern or American interns that were interned during the war. But essentially, they were enemies of the state. They lost all of their rights and possessions. So many Japanese Canadians were entrepreneurs, a lot of them fishermen. They lost their boats, they lost their houses. They were
the whole fishery community in in British Columbia in particular, where there was such a vibrant fishing industry heritage built around by the Japanese.
Yeah, and all of that was taken. But you asked, I mean, that happened, and that was a horrible part of history. But the one thing that I remember when I talked to my parents was, yes, I mean, during the internment, I'm sure they had grudges, but after it was over, it was okay. Let's get on with our life. Let's, go to school or educate or have children, have a family, make sure that the children are educated and they're well taken care of. It wasn't a time to say, oh, woe is me. That was really the biggest thing.
I think that's, amazingly generous towards the Canadian government, frankly. I mean, I certainly, and for those who maybe are less familiar with Canadian history, right after Canada having been, that time still part of, the British Empire was involved in World War II and therefore was at war with Japan. Once you have the bombing of Pearl Harbor and, that leading to then really a full-scale engagement of Canada in the efforts. also in the Pacific. And of course, we see that in 1942, then we have this internment of what has ended up being predominantly just Japanese descent, right? Canadians, although technically German descent Canadians were also declared enemies of the state, but people didn't know which people who were, from which descent lines, if they were, Caucasian white descent. And so inevitably it was mostly the Japanese Canadians that were signaled out, and 22,000 rounded up by the Canadian government and put in. I mean, maybe you would share the living conditions I visited, where those locations where they were relocated to forcibly for different periods of time, right?
When my parents my parents' families were evicted or forcibly removed from their homes, they were rounded up. No matter where they were from in BC, or there was a 100-mile line west of this 100-mile line. They were rounded up and moved to Vancouver, to what was, I believe, then called, it was called Hastings Park, which I believe now is called the P&E. And they lived in horse barns, horse sheds, or whatever they're called, stables, that's the word, yes. In, horrid conditions, and were eventually moved as intern camps were built in the interior BC. I think at that point they were given the choice to repatriate to Japan or move, or maybe that happened a little later, but eventually they were moved into these camps in interior BC, which, if you go visit today, there is actually one that I visited in New Denver, where my mother stayed. They've turned it into a memorial center. Right. It's in a beautiful location. If you go as a tourist, it is a beautiful area, but in the middle of winter, living in a wooden shack with holes in it, with no insulation, with 2 or 3 families to a shed, it wasn't so beautiful. I don't imagine, anyways.
Right. Well, and again, when I read that history as a McGill undergrad, I just thought, there was no due process. We have civil and political liberties in a democracy, and yet there was no due process. Yeah. There was no crime committed. There was no proof that any of them had done anything wrong. And the RCMP later revealed that they really had no foundations for suspecting the collaboration of the Japanese Canadian community with their fishing boats. They were alleging they would support Japan if they attacked North America. Yeah. And there was no evidence. Yeah. And so the lack of, the complete violation of democracy and of our values of due process and of having rights and freedoms protected, I found so shameful as a Canadian when I was so young, and just that is such a huge shame on our past that we need to learn from and then do better to never have this kind of arbitrary use of racial descent markings on a body to deprive us of those critical civil and political liberties. And of course, the economic side of what ended up destroying the Japanese Canadian community economic base.
It's hard to know what, of course, I don't know if my families or friends and relatives did not lose what they had. Who knows? You don't know, maybe one of them would have built a fishing empire. We don't know. We don't know. And again, I think that was the thing, the takeaway was, it happened, let's move on. Let's not worry about what could have been had the government not taken away the businesses, the shops, the restaurants, the fishing boats, etc. It happened.
Well, and then we saw, Prime Minister Mackenzie, 1944, forcibly then relocate everybody east of the Rockies. East.
And
is that how you then ended up? I mean, you're from Montreal, born and raised, but is that why your family obviously was in Quebec?
Yeah, the further east, from what my mother and father tell me, the further east you went, as during the war, you were moved, certainly from Vancouver into interior BC, and then in different parts of across the country. But the further east you went, I guess, the less danger you were. So the freer you were, there was a sense of, if you're farther east, then you're less danger, and therefore you were going to be less strict upon you. I'm not sure that the racism changed, but from what when I asked my mom about the racism piece, the only piece that I do remember that alluded to a little bit of racism based on, appearance. As I said at the beginning, I speak very basic Japanese. My parents are born and raised Canadian, grew up speaking English, and learned Japanese, from their parents and, in the little schoolrooms and whatnot, but went to school in English. So their Japanese is fairly basic. Therefore, they didn't speak Japanese to us. But one thing that my mom told me, I remember this, is growing up, once the war was over, whether they were back in Vancouver or somewhere else or in Montreal, the idea was to not be Japanese, to speak English, to assimilate to some degree. Obviously, they can't change their appearance with the jet black hair and the dark eyes or whatever.
But to not stand out.
Not to stand out by speaking a different language. So growing up, they spoke to us in English. That's partially because they aren't fluent in Japanese. They're fluent in English. So it's natural to speak in your mother tongue. But none of us grew up speaking Japanese.
With your parents?
With my parents. So that's the one maybe downside of all of this, is they're hiding as they grew up. And then as they raised us to be Canadian,
they felt they had to suppress that part
a
of
little bit,
themselves and their identity to fit into the times of that period of Canadian history when we weren't so multicultural or celebrating of diversity at that point.
Yeah. I mean, ironically, growing up, in in Montreal, Canada is a very diverse culture. Montreal, I always think, is very much, it's not a melting pot. There are so many very distinct neighborhoods, the Italian, the Greek, the Jewish, etc. Neighborhoods. But I grew up, of course, one of the few Japanese people in my high school and friends. I got the question of, where are you from? But I know that I never took it as an insult, as a racist comment. It was just, they're curious because they see somebody who looks a little different, and they actually mean, where's your family from, and originally, because the vast majority of those people, be them, Italian or Greek or Spanish or whatever it is, maybe they're white and don't stand out as being from a different country right away. A lot of them were actually, their parents were born and raised, so they're even less Canadian theoretically than I am. So I never really took it as.
And they probably always maybe get asked it if they've got an accent.
Maybe they do, yeah. And I never took it as took offense to it. But what I've come to realize is, now that I've been in Japan, and I look. So in Canada, I didn't look the part because, I'm Asian, but now I'm in Japan, I look the part. I never get the question, but by far,
you're with me though.
I'm an absolute foreigner. I'm not Japanese, so I'm very much more out of place.
I'm outing you
here, yeah.
As a foreigner,
as opposed to being back home in Canada. So,
well, and I think it's so interesting that the Canadian government at the time, the two options were move, east of the Rockies, or we'll repatriate you back to Japan where you've never lived before.
Yes. Yeah.
Why would that have been an option? And I assume that certain numbers of people did maybe decide that, wow, there's no welcome for them in Canada, and maybe they did give up and go home. And the ones who stayed needed to have that kind of generosity towards the towards Canada as a country, to be forgiving, to then want to stay and still feel like there's a place for them to contribute.
Yeah, I think like my mom, when they got out east, found a loving family, friends and whatnot, and quickly, felt at home. I don't think there are certainly not horror stories of racism. Absolutely, there had to have been. There's no doubt, but it wasn't a highlight when I spoke to my parents about their experience.
Well, and often it's just like the water you swim in. It's kind of the microaggressions that just sort of happen all the time. And sometimes it's a microaggression, and sometimes it's just because people are curious about you, and it's not necessarily meant to be, taxing. I mean, 22 odd years that I I constantly, the minute I step out of my little community, right, and people don't know me all of a sudden, then it's where are you from and why are you here and why do you speak Japanese and when are you going home? What? Like, so it's often just very much about a curiosity towards me in a positive way, but it also can be heavy to have to always constantly be sharing
the repetition of it all,
the privacy of my life choices to anybody who decides that they have a right to be curious about why this visibly
this
white looking person who thinks that this is her home community for 20 years, but is constantly being told, that we don't know that this is your home community and you don't look the part. So you need to explain yourself if you think, where you fit in. So yeah, it does have a taxing element.
It does.
So we have this kind of a reverse dynamic going on where I fit in Canada and never get asked those questions.
Exactly.
For my first half of my years of my life in Canada, and then the second half of my life in Japan, I'm constantly in your shoes. We have a little character foil going on there. So, I mean, I guess one of the things that I often find, and I'm reminded, and certainly, I guess, becoming a parent, I knew this in theory as a political scientist, that, in Canada, we had this democratic innovation that we would make our constitution recognize the multicultural heritage of Canada and take that to be worth celebrating and protecting legally and politically as a shared value, right? And and we recognize in the Constitution the presence and contributions of First Nations in Canada, and that legacy that we need to take seriously as a democratic project, right? And that's still ongoing. But thinking about how then we, as a Canadian country, really, if you look back to World War II, where race was conflated with national identity and loyalty and a sense of who is us, right? And if you were white, British passing, or French speaking white passing, you were us Canadian. But if you were not, if you were racialized Asian or Black or other, you were not necessarily seen to be loyal like us, one of us on our team, and part of the Canadianness that we saw in World War II. So pivot forward then, the last 70 years of Canadian evolution, I guess, of the democratic project, of then saying, we're going to separate out, you can be a legal and political member of this country called Canada, but there's no assumption that you have to have a certain racial or ethnic makeup, or composition.
I think something that I've sort of come to learn, certainly in discussions with you, you've really broadened my experience, but certainly as we just alluded to about the change from, my experience in Canada and now my experience here in Japan, is that, culture, the culture you experience and who you are, the language and all that doesn't come from your bloodline. And I'm the perfect example. As I said, my parents are both Japanese, born from parents that are Japanese national. So my four grandparents,
as we would say, 100%.
My four grandparents are Japanese national,
right.
and raising two children.
If we think about bloodline,
bloodline, 100% bloodline, which in Japan I believe is really important. But I am the farthest thing from being Japanese. I am Canadian. I grew up, and I said it earlier, I sort of call myself Japanese Canadian, but after having lived here for 6 years, I've come to the realization that I'm Canadian with Japanese heritage. I'm not Japanese, although I'm of Japanese bloodline.
So I think culture and language, culturally or
linguistically,
mindset,
mannerisms, and you being the 20-year veteran, understand all of these things are poking me. Don't do that. You can't do that. That's not Japanese. And I'm saying, well,
it'll bug people.
I can do that in Canada.
Yeah. Well, and I remember laughing out loud because I would say, how people see us when we walk down the street in Japan. How people see us. What do you think they see? And what was your answer?
We're a banana and the egg.
Well, but at
Right.
first you told me that you saw yourself as the Canadian guy.
Oh, I'm the Canadian guy.
And
Yeah,
I said,
I still
nobody
do.
in Japan sees you as the Canadian guy
Yeah.
when we're walking down the street. And you were like shocked.
Prior
"What?"
to pandemic, of course, standing in the train in Tokyo, I'm looking around and I would pick out foreigners and I go, oh, there's a foreigner. But I would never think that, there's another foreigner like me. There's another foreigner, white, tall white guy, whatever, all of these different people that they're foreigners just like me. Maybe I should go talk to them because they're foreigners and I'm foreigner and everything is going to be cool.
And they think
But of
you're
course,
some
they're
Japanese
looking at
dude.
me going, oh, there's another Japanese guy. There's another Japanese guy. There's another Japanese woman. I'm just a Japanese
Oh.
person by appearance. So.
And so what is the, I mean, for those who maybe don't know the expression, what does the banana and the egg mean?
Banana and the egg being banana being me, yellow on the outside and absolutely white on the inside. And that's the exact
For your
that's me.
culture, you're Canadian or
I'm
you're
purely Canadian. In my head, I am white. I am Canadian. I'm not Japanese. But Jackie, white on the outside, but knows and understands completely all of the Japanese mannerisms, culture, language, and everything like that. And I think very much thinks more like a Japanese person than I do, or understands those things. So we are the banana and the egg couple, being the, where we have these conversations. And I joke about this conversation loop that happens where if we sit down at a restaurant or we're at a store or wherever it is, and there's the two of us and there's a Japanese person serving us, I think there is also, this is not just a culture, a visual thing. In Japan, they're going to talk to the male. They're going to talk to the man. They're not going to talk to Jackie. They're going to talk to me for whatever. And we can get into those reasons later. But the conversation would start by looking at me and the person would start talking and I'm oblivious to what they're saying. And Jackie will respond. So the conversation goes from the person to me. And then Jackie would respond, and then the person would continue to look at me and talk to me, and then and it would go around like this, right, Jackie? You'd be responding, and I'd be sort of until I get to the point where I'll pull out my phone and just turn away and pretend to look because I don't want to be part of this. I can't be part of this conversation. You really got to talk to Jackie; she understands. And that just goes on and on and on and on. And it happens. It still happens when we go somewhere.
I think that will be.
People don't know us.
Happening often, and yeah, you wonder if it's certainly on first instance, maybe it's because you're looking Japanese, obviously, and depending on, certainly if you're in certain contexts professionally, often people look towards men more than they look towards women to have the answers. Yep. So, and the head of the household dynamic in Japan that is still quite valued, that gives a man a certain position to, I guess, speak for the family and things like that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And I think what I find interesting for us is when you first, I mean, we knew each other as friends in Canada. And so as friends, some of those things don't flesh out quite as in detail as when you're actually now at life partnering. And I would find that when when we were here, I really felt like we were in an international marriage. And I was like, we're two Canadians, but whoa, like I just felt like that I had a lot of integration to do to help, in some ways, you understand the relations of what we would call shinrai kanke that I have in my 22 odd years relationships of people here in Chikuma, Nagano, and how they look to my spouse to be a certain way or fulfill certain relationships of trust, and speaking on behalf of, like, being a part of this family as an extension of my trust with them. Then they give that benefit of trust to you, and they expect you to give back to them, whether you know them or not. It's just, you're a part of the family now, like you've married in or something. And so now those expectations are being placed on you, but you were oblivious. And I thought, oh, I have to really sort of, like bring you up to speed a little bit about what they're expecting, and then how do we navigate that, because it's no longer just this, well, I'm an individual and I'm me, and those are your friends and those are your relations of trust, but that doesn't have any bearing on me. But in Japan, or in this particular, and I think in Canada, we do have those deep ties of relationship, relations of trust across family formations and extended family formations, that you do in some ways have the marrying in factor, right, where there are roles that the in-law or the daughter-in-law end up taking on, or the son-in-law taking on, but how that plays out specifically in rural Japan, in northern Nagano. I was feeling like I
needed a course before I
I
came.
need to sort of explain some of those nuances. For certain of our really strong ties here, who of course now you've come to build strong relations of trust with too.
It's been a journey.
Been beautiful.
A lot of hand-holding
to see unfold. And then,
Yes.
you're the one baking them cookies and taking cookies over to them and thinking ahead to say, oh, we should, they brought us vegetables. We need to go deliver something back. How about I'll bake cookies? And you bake cookies, and I think, oh, thank God he thought of it, because I hadn't thought of it, and whatever. So the journey is really exciting in that sense, from my perspective is too. And I think we both have a Canadian side of ourselves and a Japanese side of ourselves, and it oscillates as to when we're in which mode, and then knowing when we're in which node so that we're on the same page with one another is also kind of an interesting.
I think it's interesting. You point out me having a Japanese side, mode. I don't think of it, but you do point out to me that sometimes I do things that are of
very
Japanese mode, but I don't realize it.
Yeah, and I see the influences of your parents and their sort of Japanese cultural elements that they've got from in the way they interact. And it's a really lovely, part of them that I see in you as well, that I think is so much often echoing my experience of elder Japanese here in rural Nagano, who I have relationships with, who have that similar gentle way of being, and they're so generous, and they take life in a certain speed and non-judgmentalness towards others. And there's I feel that in so many of the Jichan Bachan in our community here in rural Nagano, and then also in the way that your parents interacted with me and brought that forward. So I want to pivot a little bit the conversation, if I could, because I did on the poster say you were in global IT architect, and we haven't dived into that yet. No. There's so much to talk about on your personal history as well, but maybe you could talk to me a little bit about, you said we had our international marriage crash course when you joined me in rural Nagano, but then you also had to face, I think, a lot of culture shock at work. So can you talk to me about how your journey as a global IT architect has unfolded, and what you like about your work, and also maybe the cultural shocks that you've experienced?
Well, I remember, oddly enough, quite distinctly sitting at the airport in, I don't know what, just before, I guess maybe it was Vancouver. I said, oh, I should do a blog. I'm not a writer, but I decided and I remember the very first thing that I wrote, and I'm sure it exists somewhere if I could find it. And I said, I'm moving to a place where I'm going to become illiterate. And knowing, because I don't speak Japanese and I don't read it and all that sort of stuff and write it. But I sort of, yeah, or crazy, but I had in the back of my mind this notion that because I'm Japanese Canadian, I'll figure out the culture. There won't be this big culture shock, that I'm just gonna, no problem. Yeah, I can't read, I can't write, I can't speak, but the rest is gonna be easy. Well, that was a bit of a shock. Certainly on the work front, you touch base about work. And I think I read a lot about this early on, the Japanese work ethic, if you will. But what I've discovered, working in Japan, is that to a great extent, there's an expectation of working an exceptionally long day. It's not enforced where you leave and somebody's going to stop you at the door, but you do get that sort of pressure a little bit. And having raised two great boys that are now adults back in Canada, when they were young, I was involved. I was helping a little bit with their school, but I coached them in soccer. So we did stuff, went off to Starbucks together and that sort of thing. So I was involved in their life. So I was used to, at the end of the day is, 5 or 5:30 or maybe 6 o'clock. And certainly in the world of IT, it's constantly moving. So you do need to stay abreast of things. And sometimes, there was some late hours the evening here and there. It happened. But the norm was, the office was empty. I'm in the office at 5 o'clock. you can shoot a cannon down there's very few people in the office, but certainly in Japan, come 6 o'clock pre-COVID,
no one's packing up.
no one's backing up. It's still packed. It's still really crowded. But yet at 8:30 or whatever the start of the day is, there's a lineup to get in the building. So everybody's there on time. So it's not a flex hour thing. It's not a sort of shift hour thing. It's just everybody, or a lot of people, work late. Now, certainly in today's world, different than 10 years ago, the technology, the ease of, everybody's smartphones and tablets and remote access to everything, notwithstanding COVID, you get, emails flying back and forth and chat messages. Did you check that server? What about this? Or how about this? Or what about, can we? And it just goes back and forth throughout the evening.
And you're in a global company that's affected by all time zones.
Exactly. So you get people, at the end of our day, it's the beginning of the day in Europe. So the guys in Europe are contacting people, and it never seems to end. And it's very difficult there. It's very difficult to unplug, to say no, because, I've got a family here and I have, there are responsibilities, but they're things that I want to do. It's not like I'm saying, oh, I have to do these things at home. These are things that I want to participate in. So to get away from that was difficult, because as I said earlier, I thought it was going to be really easy. I'm going to come to Japan. I'm Japanese. I'm going to just fit in.
And there's the momentum, like the environment in which you all of a sudden are the new guy, 6 or 8 years or whatever, they're not packing up, and you're like, why is nobody packing up? It's like the end of the day, like labor code says we're done. Aren't we done? Like, have I not done enough? And so then how do you gracefully exit, because you do have child rearing responsibilities, and especially if often I think a lot of your colleagues were younger than you and maybe didn't even have kids yet, so didn't have the same pressures, but they should still go home and have their hobbies, or or I don't know, go date, or I don't know, swim, or whatever. Finding that work-life balance for men, I feel to be such a challenge in Japan in particular, that's not named or acknowledged, and how it maybe is very much the detriment of men's mental health.
I think it's a huge problem, and you're right. I think as the new guy, it was difficult, but certainly as time has gone by, and I've gotten to develop work relationships, but also friendships with a lot of the people that I work with, they certainly understand, and I do not at all feel any kind of pressure anymore that, oh, it's 6:30. Where's Mitts? How come Mitts isn't still working? And how come I can't reach Mitts to do this?
But I think you've been very strong in
setting I've stood up and
boundaries,
said no.
And sort of educating and being open about your Canadian understandings of family life, and how we as a 2-career family juggle as a team constantly, and with 2 kids under 10, it's a heck of a lot of coordination to be managing all of that all the time, right? And I think there's been a journey for all of your colleagues and people who know you about how you do have all of these things you like to be involved with and want to be involved with and are great at, obviously. I'm so grateful. And I always think how we were at the point where when, second child arrives and it's like 2 is exponentially harder. Like, right? I mean, holy crow. And so then who is, just even managing who's on daycare drop, who's on daycare pickup. And then you're saying, well, we're going to use an IT tool here. I've set it up. This is a shared calendar. I'm plugging in when you pick up, and I'm plugging in when you drop, and I'm plugging in. And then we would every single night go, okay, who's dropping, who's picking up, who's dropping, who is in the calendar, so that we wouldn't forget our kids, right?
Yeah, the whole week had to be laid out, because it was so, as you said, so crazy with, 2 careers and 2 young children.
And a long commute to daycare, because we couldn't find daycare near home in Tokyo, which was a challenge. Huge challenge.
That was a real burden, and it was a really difficult time for the family, for us as a couple, for at work, for you at work, for me at work. It was just really stressful. But I think our togetherness, our, saying, that it wasn't going to be a 50-50, just let's tally up all the things and say, okay, you're responsible this half and you're responsible for this half. No, it was, let's look at your strengths. What what do you do well, Jackie? And certainly the language part, the legal part, all of that stuff, of course you excel. And even in English, I think if we were
Communications with
living
the
back in
schools
Canada,
and
you would still be better at it than I am. But there's pieces that I'm better at. So, it's not about let's divvy them up. It's let's say
Well, and I
let's
think we
work on whose
tried to do
strengths.
that. We tried to do a little bit of that in the
We
beginning, and
did,
I was
yeah.
dying under having to cook. Oh my God, I was just, I was trying to menu plan and multitask cooking and unhooking so I can go think and plan to cook the meals, and then I'm not good at it. And when you finally said, you know what, why don't you just let me handle all the menu planning and the cooking? And I went, oh, thank God. Because not my strength, and that takes a huge mental load off what I'm not good at. And I would much rather, handle school communications and all the Japanese and all the whatever that has to be done in Japanese and other
I think
pieces.
that's a key piece, is that work on your strengths. And that's something at work, is excuse me, there's people who are good at X and people that are good at Y. So although you do want to continue to train people, and I think that's a key part to something that I don't know if we don't seem to do enough in Japan, is that training piece, but to get to build on people's strengths
and
is
use
great.
the diversity of our strengths to real advantage, right? In that sense, as our team. And yeah, absolutely. I've had to lean on you a lot for all of my IT infrastructure and understanding how I need to set things up for enjoi. And I've been very grateful to have all of that in-house, tech advising, because otherwise I wouldn't know how to set things up and make it secure for my company and things that I have to think about. So that certainly is, certainly has been a blessing to combine our strengths in that way. And I think it makes us a stronger couple and a stronger household. And hopefully our children are seeing us role model this so that they won't have stereotypes, around what you can or can't do because you're a girl or a boy or whatever it is. And I guess another area where I think really I've enjoyed collaborating with you has been on these your Lego hobby, which now time is fleeting, but we have sort of a couple of minutes to talk about. We've been doing now two big multicultural Lego play festivals in northern Nagano here, featuring all of your collection and your genius around Lego building and design and getting children to play through the Lego Club that you lead for the International Association here, that's been going strong for 20 years, but then we could add in your passion for Lego.
I think this is another great example of leveraging strengths, where your strength is you're certainly seeing the vision of what could benefit Chikuma or Chikuma International Association, and how we can introduce new people, hopefully engage, certainly because this is Lego, which, although I know the Lego Corporation is really working hard to make it less gender based, but it is, I would gather, still more boys playing with Lego, but I think they're working very hard at bringing in girls. But maybe this would engage the fathers and say, hey, so you vision all of this, and you come up with all these great ideas, and all I have to step in.
Our kids, I see you teaching our kids on hours doing all of this Lego building with them, and they are enraptured.
Yeah, they love it. I mean, it's great. I think it's great. It's great bonding. My boys back home, growing up for many, many years, Christmas was Lego. Lego. What is Lego?
It was a tradition now.
It was just obscene amounts of Lego. And to this day, actually, my oldest son is still, and has a YouTube channel. He still does the Lego, because there's a huge it's called an AFOL community, adult fan of Lego. AFOL. There is a huge community of building all kinds of great things, and I think that Lego itself has been, or is, a great tool. In fact, the Lego Corporation has what I deem as a separate arm of the Lego Education Division, where they have developed kits and education platforms for schools, and there are schools that teach these programs. It's a great way to teach STEM, but not only STEM. When we might think about Lego as being, building bricks to build houses or cars or airplanes or whatever it is,
right?
But I think it much like reading a book, it's not about just reading the book and getting to the end. It's learning new words or ways to use words and develop that creative part of your brain. Well, I think that's what Lego does too. It says, well, I got to build, I have to build something round with square bricks. How do I do it? Well, you use your imagination.
Right.
Sure, it's never going to be exact, and I think that's really good. One of the things that I remember, I know I've been teaching our kids a lot about Lego. They sometimes would get stress about putting the bricks in, and then, oh, I made a mistake. And I always say, it's Lego. No harm, no foul. Take it apart and put it together again. That's the great thing about Lego. There's no real thing as a mistake, but
There's no failure.
There's no failure. And that's something in Japan where I've sort of seen, back to, jumping back a little bit to work, is that there is this no willingness to stick your neck out because you don't want to fail. You don't want to make that mistake. Whereas, with Lego, just do it. And if it's never wrong, it's, maybe not.
Well, it kind of takes away the space of experimentation and play out of work that I think could drive innovation in not just innovation for the benefit of the companies, but also enjoyment in the journey of the work, right? If you can have that sense of play and a psychological safety that you can make a mistake and it won't be the end of your career.
Yes. And I think this is something that I'm certainly trying to teach our kids, is that,
and the kids of Chikuma in Nagano,
and Chikuma with the Lego clubs that we do, is
the
that
festival here,
you just build, and there is no mistake. You just build, and it is what it is. And if you don't like it, take it apart and start over. And there's no harm, no foul.
Well, on that amazing takeaway note, I mean, I think if we can all certainly find that space of, I guess, play, innovation, using our diversities, playing to our strengths, but also learning to be open to other people's teachings and their diversities that can help us evolve and morph through learning their experiences and building those connections and bonding through these experiences together of enjoyment and play and work. I mean, if all work could be somewhat more playful and enjoyable, I think, it blends into your hobbies, and then there will be these different boundaries around what we consider to be the FaceTime day job in the future of work that I think is both exciting, but it also has to be democratizing so that it doesn't enslave us as well. And that's the tension, right? That's really the tension that we're looking at. So I want to thank you, Mitts, for sharing about your identities, yourselves, your multiple selves, depending on where you are and which period of your life and which country you're living in, which hat you're wearing at any given day. I certainly am blessed to experience that every single day of my life with you as my life partner. And I'm very grateful that you would join us today on the show.
Well, I'm grateful to have been chosen as your first, to sort of hopefully made it inviting for the rest of your thought partners that will come on and share their insights and views into their life experiences and business experiences, but it's just been a lot of fun, a lot of fun to share and talk about all of this sort of stuff. And I hope that your listeners here can take away a little bit of the few bits that I've shared and be of interest to, whether it be something as dark as the Japanese internment or something as fun as the Lego, play that we do here in Chikuma.
Excellent. Well, and on that note, I'd love to share an announcement. So I hope that you will all join us next week. I'm very excited to welcome Shu Matsuo Post, who will be the second person featured, and he will be talking about his book, I Took Her Name, and his journey into feminism and trying to fight for his right as a man to choose his last name, and that he wanted to share it with his wife and have his name be in that dynamic, and his journey into vulnerability, masculinity, and feminism. I also would love to just mention that, of course, Enjoy Diversity and Innovation has offerings. We have a multidisciplinary team, consultants, educators, and facilitators. We offer workshops, training, and of course, consulting for audits of your company infrastructure and of your policy ecosystems, if that should help you move the dial in this area. Check out our website, www.en-joi.com. And I want to give a shout out to the Enjoy team. There's so many beautiful people who have contributed their talents and gifts to make this live stream possible. And I am pleased to now play the credits here that will follow right after this. So please tune in. You'll hear a beautiful song by Andrea Menard, who is an Enjoy Thought partner and a wonderful Canadian singer and songwriter based out of Vancouver. So please stay tuned for that. And it will just play for about 3 minutes of this beautiful song to help you transition your life now into your next steps in your workday if you're here in Japan with us. And on that note, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
The window in my parlor shines on my favorite chair. I sit and watch the season turn as white as my hair. So many years older, a frosty pallor has touched my skin, but I